The future belongs to service providers who innovate without limits. That's why the fastest growing service providers are choosing the NetSapiens platform. Visit netsapiens.com.
Hey everybody, it's Doug Green and I'm the publisher of Technology Reseller News, and I'm very pleased to have with me today Rory Stasko, who's the CEO of Telstra International. Rory, thank you for joining me today.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for having me on.
So the topic of the day is resilience, and as everyone can see from the crawl there, we're going to be discussing in depth a new Economist Impact study supported by Telstra that explores this in the US, UK, and Germany. We'll talk about their findings. We'll talk about what that means for everybody and some ideas that Telstra International has for the community. But first, Rory, what is Telstra International?
No, thanks, Doug. Telstra International is super interesting. We're the international arm of Telstra, which is a traditional operator across Australia. Interestingly, Telstra International has been in the market more than 75 years, operating in subsea and international connectivity. We're the largest carrier-owned or wholly owned subsea cable operator across APAC. But we operate in this market really connecting the US to Asia, Asia to the US, and then obviously Australia in between the two of those. So we're the single largest critical infrastructure operator across markets like Singapore, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, Philippines, and some of the fastest growing hubs as data centers grow throughout the region. So we're a material player if you look into the subsea or connectivity market across the region.
So, Rory, let's go and define a few terms. What do we mean when we say large-scale digital disruption? I think I know what that means, but maybe I don't.
Yeah, no, great question. And I think, as we look at how the market's evolving, Doug, once upon a time, connectivity was a little bit boring. Is sort of taken for granted in many ways. But as we see data centers being built out, as we see the dependency on sort of both inference and training centers in various regions around the world, we start to piece together all of the components that build out this digital infrastructure. And so as we talk about connectivity, we talk about power, we talk about data centers, we talk about GPU capability, all of these sort of form, in my mind, what we would describe as digital infrastructure. I think to the point of the discussion, resilience is about how all these pieces come together. And so what we worry about from a digital disruption is if you don't have all of these various components operating effectively and in sync in a way, then you start to not be able to provide the capability that's required through this digital infrastructure layer. Now, I think beyond that, many people are looking at, well, why are we doing this? And I think that's the point of when you say digital disruption, what is this new capability that's coming? And I don't have to say it, it's in every other article that you'll see above and below this. It's about AI. It's about the power of AI. It's about what AI will be able to do for us at every level, whether that's at a societal level, whether it's at a company level, whether it's at an individual level. This digital disruption is what's changing. And as we think about our space and the world that we operate and where we get to play, that is in the digital infrastructure that supports it. And so as I think about the two of those, how is there's this explosion of AI and the demand for that, but it can't operate without the actual infrastructure to run it. And that's the digital infrastructure that we're playing in. And so you can talk about, to your point, digital disruption could be about the end services, or it could be the disruption into what has been a relatively sleepy industry, say 10 years ago, in digital infrastructure, which is having a renaissance now in terms of the necessity, the criticality, and the intrinsic sort of need in many ways that people have for digital infrastructure.
Well, let's dive into what you found. Now,
Sure.
you surveyed US, United Kingdom, and Germany. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, so we looked actually across about 1,400 senior executives across 11 APAC markets. And then we used some US, UK, and Germany benchmarks. And so our focus was really in many ways on Asia Pacific, because that's where the majority of our assets and the parts of our digital infrastructure sit today. And so we looked across these companies with the Economist Impact report to assess how do senior leaders, how do executives feel about resilience? What does that look like? And we looked across 5 pillars. We looked across the external environment, technology, risk management, leadership, and then workforce agility.
So I would have thought that with, a lot of discussion about this, I think I've heard a lot of discussion about this, you would have found more preparation, but that's not what you found.
Yeah, it was actually super interesting because I think this is a topic that so many people spend time on. But when we looked across that cross section, across sectors, but across an executive pool, there were sort of three themes that sort of came out through
Hmm.
that. First, that disruption is constant. Everybody is feeling it, everybody's seeing it, but performance under pressure is actually very weak. And so, as much time as people spend thinking about resilience, they do it in the vacuum of actually sort of the pressure of when something breaks, what happens? How do we deal with that? And I think that was sort of one critical finding that we had through it. The second was actually a lot of people think about individual components and resilience of components, but the biggest blind spot was the ecosystem risk. It's about how all the pieces fit together and then the dependencies. So if one thing fails, how does that flow through into somewhere else in the system and how do they work through that? So really about that ecosystem risk. And then the third, which I think was probably to your point, probably most important, is resilience really fails due to leadership and governance gaps, not technology. So actually, from a technology perspective, we're really good at building, business continuity plans and sort of building resilience at an individual point of connection or an asset level. But it's actually across, leadership and governance where there are gaps that emerge when something fails that relate to sort of point one and point two. And so I thought that was sort of most interesting about how do leaders think about building a network, building sort of a capability to look at their organization, to look at that ecosystem, and to think about how are they building resilience through that.
Roy, that third point sort of surprises me because even before we were talking about AI and cybersecurity and so on nonstop, I think I kept on hearing the words culture of
Yeah,
security in the same sentence, lots and lots. So what's going on? Why are we, after all this, and
yeah.
we're not talking about the regular people in the company, you're saying actually the leadership.
Well, I think it's actually when it's when the system comes together. And again, to that ecosystem point, Doug, I think if we look at individual slices, so if you think of security, we spend a lot of time as organizations and as leaders thinking about how do we build resilience into our cybersecurity or into our physical security system. Whether that's at a physical layer, at a logical layer, we will think through how are we building resilience, what could go wrong, and how will that work. But if we think about resilience as it looks across the organization and it connects to other leaders in the business, that's where some of those gaps emerge. And it's the governance, the accountability about how do the two pieces connect about that ecosystem that we've seen sort of fall down. So if we look at some of the results from the study, really it's this technology and infrastructure, the weakest scoring pillars overall. But that's because as the accountability starts to diffuse as you move further into the business. And so, while there's, as an example, there's very clear responsibility in areas like IT or risk functions, but oftentimes boards are less engaged at that level, and organizations really struggle to translate the investment that's required into action during a disruption itself. It's an area where I know from a Telstra perspective, we spend a lot of time with our board looking at the system across the business and thinking about where we need to make investments, not just for one part of the business, where it's cyber or IT or physical security, but we look at that lateral view about how are we building resilience across the system and how are we thinking about us as a business in terms of where we operate. And so I think that's to your point. There's been a lot of talk about it, and it goes narrow down, but it's that lateral component that makes it at hardest. And I think, final thing I'll say is that the data makes it clear that resilience improves fastest in a way when it's treated as a leadership discipline, embedded
Hmm.
into governance, embedded into investment decision making, embedded into the operating models from the outset rather than as an afterthought.
Yeah, and let me also try to define or understand when you say leadership, how far up the board is it? Are you talking about the IT leadership or general leadership of an organization?
This goes all the way to the board of directors,
All the
and
way up.
this is something that goes all the way up. And I think it's something that within Telstra, I look after the international business. but up to our group CEO and up to the board of directors. And that's not just sort of the responsibility of a committee of the board, it actually is the responsibility of the full board. And so as they think about resilience for us as a business, they will be looking at what is the governance model? What is how are we making investment decisions? How are we going to measure our investment decisions relative to the risk exposure of our organization and from a resilience perspective? And how does that build into our operating model? How does that flow into accountability? So they will look not just then at what is the CEO doing, but they will then look at our CEO's leadership team beneath that, and how do each of the pieces stack up, and what are those interconnection points in the operating model of how they operate. And I think it's been a learning for us, and I think it's in many ways it's something that I've found that many telcos actually come to somewhat more naturally because of our broad regulatory requirements that we carry, and having to show up to our regulators to talk about resilience, because we are in many ways critical infrastructure. We're quite essential in many ways to emergency calling and disaster situations and other components. But many other companies haven't been put under that same regulatory scrutiny in a way that many telcos have. Now, we're not perfect as a telco either, and we recognize that, but I think it is a little bit in our culture to think about how do we operate to that high level of resilience standard, not in an individual system or an individual box, but actually in the holistic piece of the system.
Before we move on, I'm kind of stuck on the issue of leadership, and I'm kind of thinking, especially about companies that don't maybe see themselves as technology companies. So,
Yeah.
we're building cars, we're renting rooms, we're flying airplanes, we're shipping boxes. We're not lending money, that's regulated. Caring for people at a hospital, that's really regulated, and so on.
Yes.
But a lot of other activities, I can imagine, I can at least feel almost that the board members don't see their principal role as this. So, how are you at
Yeah.
Telstra then sort of bridging that gap?
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think one of the things that if you ask end customers, um, they have become increasingly dependent on all of the companies that they interact with in a way. And I think you can see that even in people who operate cloud services today.
Mm,
If the internet isn't working for a period of time in their region or their town, and they're at work, all of a sudden things come to a stop. Or if they're trying to make a shopping decision and they're out at a mall someplace, and all of a sudden, I don't know if the something were to happen in that mall, whether a power failure in a place and the store wasn't operating right, or even if the Wi-Fi wasn't working in that place and they weren't able to actually process a transaction, the whole ecosystem falls apart in a way. And it's sort of how do you think about that multi-layer of resilience? And so I think to your point, some boards aren't thinking about it that way. Customers
right.
are. And so I think that's where the expectations have risen, and people as end consumers and customers are expecting that of the companies that they do business with. And so I think it's incumbent on boards to shift their mindset. Now, the criticality to your point of, what is the consequence of the service not working, of
Yeah.
the business stopping for a period of time? If it's a hospital or an airline, the consequences of having a failure in a system in a way is much more critical than shopping at a mall, to use my example. Now, I'm probably putting some value judgments in that statement, but I think we could probably all agree in that, it has to be relative to the consequence in a way. But I still think that increasingly, I think companies and boards are shifting their mindset to how does this work? And we see that, to be honest, Doug, through companies that you may not think are thinking that way, but as they think about how they build, say, their digital infrastructure, they're thinking about everything from the geopolitics of the world, supply chain movement. They're thinking about multiple ways to get goods and data around the world in different directions. To give them diversity and resilience into a system. So it may not be necessarily about having resilience on let me choose as an example, a Singapore to US internet connection where you want to have multiple paths. But instead, they're thinking, well, what if we can't use that path? What if we need to go a different way? What if we need to
Right.
go through India or through Europe or back the other way around the world to get to the United States? Maybe it's thinking about how you build resilience through using a combination of terrestrial fiber. In Australia, we operate the largest fiber network, and so we're able to build greater resilience to people's systems as we can provide terrestrial alternatives relative to subsea. as they think about using Australia as a connection point to Asia. And so I think, there's lots of different ways that people will think about how they build that resilience.
So it sounds almost like you're saying that you're getting you at Telstra International are getting boards to kind of like own this by understanding that they're not just in the business of, renting a room or renting out space in a mall. The customer in the mall is expecting something.
I think our challenge and our opportunity for us is we work with our partners, whether they're enterprise companies, whether they're carriers, whether they're the tech and hyperscaler companies. We work with them to say, how are you building your resilience and what options can we give you? And if you look at these are material investments. They're material purchases that people will be making, and we don't take that lightly. And so it's building a case for how do you make that investment? How do you do it in a way that's economical within the context of the businesses that we're working with, but using technology as a solution for that? And I think some of that, Doug, is about how we move beyond just a company has a need, they go out to procure something, and they buy that from us, to how do we engage more deeply into their investment team, into their infrastructure team, into the end users of the service within the organization, so that rather than the purchasing team making an advocacy what we're arguing for, the actual operators of the network, or even one step further into the organization, to the business users, are making the advocacy to their management, to the board, about the criticality of infrastructure and why resilience in the system of infrastructure, not just necessarily an individual component of it, is critical to their business and their operations. And that's where we continue to drive advocacy.
As we close up our podcast today, is this topic actually something that should be on the radar of the channel community, the MSPs and the channel partners, the reseller people, and so on?
Absolutely. And I think for a couple of reasons. I think one, it lets you change the narrative and the discussion into customers. So rather than, again, just being a supplier, I think you start to be a partner and part of that ecosystem. And so I think absolutely it's important for that community to be able to talk about the importance of this. I also think it helps elevate further in the organization the discussion. And if, boards and leadership teams aren't talking about what their digital infrastructure strategy is, what their broader connectivity strategy is, if you're operating in a business that needs to connect to other locations or to customers, then they need to have a plan for this. And I think it's not just about relying on public internet any longer. If they have a service that is part of the proposition, it's critically important. But to be honest, Doug, it's very rarely that one company can be a one-stop shop for anyone. And I think that's where both the MSPs and the carrier community and the channel community are part of that. It becomes an ecosystem play. And to my comments before, it is in that ecosystem, I think, understanding how they use this as a mechanism to sell, but also understanding the criticality of their role in that process and what they need to be doing, and understanding about why their customers will be more dependent upon them in the future than they are today is critical.
Rory, there's a lot to discuss, a lot to unpack and all that, but for now, I want to really thank you for joining me today, opening up this topic. I hope we get another chance to explore some of the things we discussed today, but for now, where can we learn more about Telstra International and your report?
Yeah, great. Easy to find us on LinkedIn, Telstra International. You can just search us there. We have a link through to the report on the same site, or obviously the Economist Impact report study can be found through the Economist website. So I'd encourage people to click through and link there. And I'd love to come back and talk more about it. Super passionate about it, and always happy to come on. Thanks for having me.
Rory, my favorite magazine, my favorite topic. What could be better? Great podcast. Thank you very much indeed. I'll look forward to our next one.
Sounds good.
Innovate without limits, scale without compromise, and never pay per seat again. Discover why providers choose netsapiens.com.